Okay, let's take a look at practice question number 5. All right, so practice question number 5. Hopefully I'm close enough to the board now. The camera's close enough to the board that you guys can see. Okay, so the question asks, assume that a country's economy is currently in recession. And part A, draw a correctly labeled graph of the long run and short run Phillips curves. Label the current equilibrium as point Z. All right, so let's take a look at that first. All right, part A. So for our Phillips curves, we're going to have inflation, we're going to have unemployment. Remember, our long run Phillips curve is going to be vertical, long run Phillips curve, short run Phillips curve, downward sloping. Okay, and now it says that we're in a recession. Okay, so remember with the long run Phillips curve, all right, that's going to be tied into full employment, the natural rate of unemployment. All right, so if we're in a recession, we're going to have more unemployment than we normally would. So that means our point on the short run Phillips curve needs to be somewhere to the right of that intersection. Okay, so anywhere to the right of that intersection would be fine. All right, and we want to label that point Z, okay, and then dash our lines and create that current equilibrium. Okay, so that's part A. All right. Part B says to assume banks in the country hold no excess reserves and the public's holding of currency is constant, like we talked about yesterday. That just means that the public is holding money like they normally would. They're not saving more, spending more. They're just holding on to currency like they normally would. The reserve ratio is 25%. The central bank of the country buys $100 billion in bonds from the non-bank public. So again, all that means is that they're still buying $100 billion worth of bonds. And so that's really just the thing to kind of keep in mind there. All right, so for part B, and then part 1 of part B says, by how much will the monetary base of the country change? Well, now that their central bank has purchased $100 billion worth of bonds, it's now injected $100 billion into the monetary base, the M1 component of that nation's money supply. All right, remember when the Fed buys bonds, what do? They exchange cash for the bond, so they're pumping money in. So for part 1 there, right, it's $100 billion, okay? Now for part 2, it says calculate the change in the amount of loans in the banking system in the country. So they want to figure out, how much lending capacity is there, how many new loans could be created. So again, we got to make sure we look at our money multiplier, right? Because if we're trying to figure out the total amount of new loans that could be created, we need to know our money multiplier. We know the reserve requirement is 25%. So if we go 1 divided by 0.25, that gives us a money multiplier of 4. All right. Then we're going to take that 4 and we're going to multiply it by this 100 billion. Right? That gives us 400 billion. Okay. But remember, you have to then take back out that initial 100 because it's already there. It's already been created. All right, so for part 2, it's 300 billion in new dollars that could be created. Okay, 300 billion in new. And then for part 3, it just asks what's the total change. All right, the total change now is adding that 100 back in. The initial 100 billion, all right, for the bond purchase, okay, and then the 300 billion that it was able to create. Right, so for part 3, it winds up being 400 billion. Okay. Part C, now draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market. Show the effect of the change in the money supply identified in part B3 on the nominal rate of interest. All right, so money market, right? Remember, it's going to be the nominal rate of interest. I'm abbreviating a little bit. The quantity of money. All right, remember that's always M1. All right, we've got our money supply, money demand. There's our nominal rate of interest. And now we know that we purchased $100 billion worth of bonds, so we added to the money supply. So you're going to get a rightward shift in the money supply, and that lowers the nominal rate of interest. And nominal rate of interest lowers. All right? And then for part D, we need to come back over here to part A. All right? Because it says, assume there's no change in inflationary expectations. All right, so we're not changing anything as far as inflation. We're expecting the normal amount of inflation. On your graph in part A, label a point W that is consistent with the effect of the change in the nominal rate identified in part C. So if the nominal rate lowers, like we see here, that should encourage more borrowing and spending by businesses and by consumers. So that should boost aggregate demand. If we boost aggregate demand, that means we should see less unemployment. So point W just has to be somewhere in between here. We may not be getting all the way back to full employment, right? But we're getting a little bit of a boost, okay? So point W just has to be somewhere in that particular range, all right? So that's practice question 5.